Hello, it's Molly here with Anya Star Hart, who we are very lucky to have today. Anya, for the past 25 years, has immersed herself in deep soul searching in pursuit of inner peace, self acceptance, unconditional love, and wholeness. Her journey has fueled her passion to help others remember, reclaim, and rebirth the divine love and wisdom within their own hearts. Anya started sharing transformational work by teaching forest yoga and Nia. She evolved into doing healing work with clients in 2015 when she became a certified emotional code practitioner. In early 2019, Anya completed a shamanic healing trainer with Susan Thunder Raven of Wolfsong's School of Shamanic Healing. Anya is a certified angel guide and combines various healing modalities to help women transform their emotional overwhelm into a state of unconditional self-love so they can live out their heart's desire. Anya lives with her family and maintains a healing practice in Central Virginia. So Anya, welcome. We are really happy to have you on Things That Matter. And I'm curious about a story, your story, that you want to share with listeners.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be able to share my story. I feel like sharing it, really, the objective for me is just to let other people know that to feel comforted by whatever situation they're in, that it's possible to shift and transform out of it. So there's actually several parts to my story, and I just want to focus on one part, and that's the beginning of my story. My parents and grandparents fled Ukraine during World War II because it wasn't safe to be there anymore. And actually, my paternal grandfather had been arrested twice and sent to labor camp because of his social and political activism in his village. So it was not safe for the family. And so they both fled and had these long transits across Western Europe. Both families ended up in displaced persons camps in West Germany. And so their whole journey was about 7 years long. And then they immigrated to the United States in 1951 and basically started life all over again. So both sides of my family, that was my parents, their siblings, and their parents, so my grandparents. Wow. There is something to say, though, about Ukrainian culture, which is that in these displaced persons camps, they were very self-organized and structured schooling and hobby activities and like self-organizing. And there was a wave of immigrants that came before that. So by the time my parents came to the United States, and this is stuff I've read about also, and I experienced it growing up, but there were already communities intact. So for Ukrainians immigrating to America, their transition was made easier and they adapted maybe better than other cultures because they had already sort of made these connections in the displaced persons camps in Germany. And it sort of just continued in the United States. So there was kind of this seamless almost flow. And it's not to diminish like the difficulty they might have had starting life over in a new culture, but they had a community within which to do that and, guidance and support that way. So for me, it was actually really enjoyable. I didn't know anything different. Growing up Ukrainian, I was very immersed in the culture. I spoke Ukrainian at home. I went to church. I went to Ukrainian school. I was a scout. I participated in music ensembles. I had like a whole rootedness in that culture. But at the same time, I was growing up as an American, which my parents didn't have that experience. And the second thing my parents didn't have an experience of is like a coming of age, and any rituals, because that had all been taking place for them. My mother was 7 when they fled Ukraine and my father was 13. So their formative years were spent sort of in transit without a home country, like still kind of maintained in a culture, but I just felt like I bumped up against a lot of things when I started to hit adolescence, because there were things that I was wanting to do, like express my independence or express aspects of myself that felt really threatening to one of my parents. And that had a lot to do with their loss and trauma that had never been resolved. But the difficulty was that those weren't things we ever talked about. So the other kind of piece about the culture was that, you know, it's like we just keep moving forward, we self-organize, we resolve our issues by banding together and just creating structure for ourselves. But the talk of trauma or needing to heal emotionally or anything like that, that just wasn't part of, I think, the cultural lexicon in America, much less, that's not like feeling into your emotions kind of wasn't a thing in my culture either. So, and my mother had a lot of loss on her journey over to the United States. Her mother passed away in a displaced persons camp when she was 9. So my mom was orphaned for a while, and they'd been separated from their father because he had to stay back in another country. So it's like there were all these layers of trauma that it's like we all knew the story of where everybody came from and what they'd been through, but nobody had actually gone through the process of feeling any of it. So I really, you know, what I've learned about trauma is when you're not feeling the emotions of trauma, you're shutting off your ability to feel. And that's essentially kind of the space that I was brought up in. So it felt dangerous for me to have my own feelings. So I feel like a lot of things I've learned are sort of in hindsight. And I realized that I was born as a very intuitive child. So I was actually sensing and feeling what was being held in the energy field. Like I was feeling into the trauma, feeling into the sorrow and the grief and all of that. Yet I didn't have any validation of that because what people were talking about was like not in alignment with that. And so it was almost like I had to shut down what I was feeling and intuiting in myself to just connect. I mean, that's essentially kind of like what we do to connect. So I lost my ability to know what I was feeling, to trust my intuition. And so my ability to feel safe in the world had to do with like projecting and sort of depending on other people. So it's kind of like what people might call codependency. And it's not to say my parents didn't love me, you know, my parents, you know, loved me. There was just this huge gaping hole in I think emotional intelligence and the ability to like be okay with feeling emotions, because I feel like they were both holding so much pain, and my grandparents as well. And somehow it, you know, we know things about epigenetics, that like trauma that's not healed gets passed on biologically. And I, like, looking back now, realize that it was just wanting to express through me. But I didn't have the structure to know how to do that. So the things that I experienced in my childhood, I basically almost turned against myself. Does that make sense? Like,
how would that have shown up? Like how would that have?
Well, so yeah, so kind of going forward, lots of challenges sort of like through high school. And then I ended up in a relationship, and we ended up getting married. And the first sort of signs started to emerge around communication between my spouse and myself. And you know, I thought I was communicating, but I was actually just either being passive aggressive or wanting him to infer things from me, because that was the model I had. And thankfully we had a friend, we were sort of like out to lunch, my husband and my friend and I said something that was passive aggressive and sort of like a jab at my friend. And he basically confronted me. Thankfully, he confronted me about it and brought it to my attention. And then he gave me a tool to use, and it was I wish I remembered what it was called. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I essentially, like, anytime I would have a miscommunication, usually with my husband, it became apparent that, you know, it's like that friction that was there and just, we wouldn't have a resolution. And then I would sit down and I would write out what I had said. And then I would sit and actually really need to connect into what I had been feeling and just write down feelings. And then take a look at that statement again and realize that I hadn't been connecting to my feelings and I wasn't outwardly expressing my feelings. So then I would have to rewrite what I actually had intended to say with my feelings included in that statement. And I just did that over and over and over again. So I feel like that was, you know, like the first step into uncovering like that awareness of the fact that I wasn't even connected into my own emotions, that I didn't have like direct access to my emotions in certain moments.
Wow.
Yeah. And then the other piece after that, going forward, it sort of gave my husband permission. You know, he was kind of like my advocate because he kind of understood my situation. So in conversation, when something like that would come up, it kind of evolved into something deeper, but then he would be the one confronting me. And it was like really painful and uncomfortable because I'd have to stop in the middle of a conversation and get access to those feelings. Like I stopped doing it on paper and then I started doing it real time. But I was always overcome, like at the end there'd be resolution and I'd understand, you know, something and could redo it. Like we would have to redo a moment. But it filled me with a lot of shame because I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm putting this person that I love through this. But it was also internalized shame, you know, that I had been holding from my childhood, that somehow it was my fault or, you know, I was responsible for this. And ultimately it was my job to unpack it. But over time, like many years down the road, I learned a lot about that shame, and I learned a lot about just holding a space for myself in forgiveness. Even the shame, I feel like, is the hardest emotion to experience. And I don't know, I just have had some lessons about shame and where it comes from and just how to be in a space with it. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I'm curious about the process of going from, you know, externalizing something, which it sounds like that was the pattern,
Yeah.
to actually learning how to experience the felt sense of what's actually happening.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, and then what is the opportunity there? Like what's actually happening? And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I had several opportunities to kind of uncover that part too. One being this work I did with a counselor that's called Internal Family Systems, which was really helpful because that dealt with like, you know, I feel like when you get cut off from your connection to emotions, it's like this cutoff, like from here down, sort of. Right. And so everything is like energetically, I feel like up here, and it's just because it tends to go into this like vigilant mental space of like self-protection, and all kinds of stories run around in the mind. And so that's sort of the space I was in. And with internal family systems, but the way the process goes, I really, like, I had someone teach me how to connect into the witness part of myself. I was like, oh, and somehow I feel like I'm very kinesthetic and I can connect in with suggestions for how something feels, I guess. So the counselor did a good job with that for me. And once I kind of found that witness part, you know, the part that observes behavior, that is non-judgmental, that is loving, and, you know, can sit with whatever's coming up, like somehow I was able to connect with that. And then I was also able to pull apart the various aspects of myself, like the angry part of me and like the grieving part of me and like the shame part of me, and like separate them out of the intertwined connections they all had, and like sort of like see each one for what they were. And just by dropping into that witness space, I feel like it really taught me about holding sacred space for all the parts of myself and learning to listen. And because each part was playing a role, I guess, in my ego mind, that they were all sort of self-protective parts, or parts that were dealing with trauma or dealing with a situation, and they were unaware of one another. And simply by like pulling all these individual parts of me into a space I could listen to the anger and hear what it had to say, and I could listen to the scared part of me and hear what it had to say. And just by doing that, it just created this instant sort of transformative energy that parts that felt like they were separate from one another and separate from me then found a way to become interdependent and whole and realize that they are part of a working whole. And like that was, I feel like, instrumental, like an instrumental sort of introduction into the what I kind of call the higher self. And then I also later on, you know, I had a yoga teacher who understood the principles of like somatic experiencing and feeling energy and emotions in the body, and using the yoga practice to breathe and be present with what's coming up, like in whatever pose that you're in. What are you hitting up against emotionally, and what blockages are there, and learning to work with the blockages. And she created a safe space for people to emote. Like, I feel like we don't find that a lot in our culture, but, you know, like emoting pain and anger, you know, like verbally, she really created this beautiful place to feel safe doing that, which allows that energy to come through and release. And then I also sought a counselor later on who did core energetics, which is sort of another aspect of body-oriented psychotherapy. So I learned a lot about not only tuning into what's going on with me mentally, but how it's all connected in my body, and how we hold memories of trauma or pain in our bodies, and connecting the two and feeling things from a body point of view. And I also feel like, you know, when we connect to where we hold pain and we're able to release it, it opens up space for us to feel something else. It opens us up to have space between us and our negative emotions. I mean, I kind of feel like that's what happens when I work with people doing emotion code. Because I find that when you're sort of overwhelmed with emotions, sometimes we're just so in them, we can't separate ourselves from the emotions. And it's just those surface energies, you know, we kind of want to find a way to let them go, whether it's through that process of emoting, say, in a safe space, or releasing the energy somehow. That I've found that it creates a space for you to be in that witness space where you can, you know, if a situation comes up, you're not reacting to it, but you actually might have a moment to respond in some way, or see that it's happening. And the more that happens, the more you can stay present. Because, yeah, I feel like I could talk about this forever, but because I feel like the process of understanding your emotional self starts always in the after, like after an event. And then you start to get really good at, you know, my yoga teacher called that stalking, like stalking where your emotions are coming from, what's triggering you. And you just start to kind of get more and more aligned with things as they start happening in the moment. But it just takes practice and awareness and staying with it and being kind and gentle with yourself when something happens, because our tendency is to be hard on ourselves when we like get into a situation where something gets triggered and you feel like, what just happened, you know?
Yeah. I'm reminded when you were talking about the parts work, I'm reminded, and in them acting ultimately as part of a whole, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And then when you're talking about just, I don't know your doctor words, but bringing your awareness back into, I mean, my words around it would be the physical body to work with stuff. It's almost like a metabolization of the energy. You know, when the awareness can remain with the actual felt experience versus going off reaction or whatever. It's almost like kind of a metabolization.
That is a really good way to put it. Yeah, it's it's a kinesthetic sort of recognition and a feeling. Yeah, it's almost like it enables you to come back to it.
What kind of metabolizes the energy? I mean, it has to release,
right?
And as long as we're sitting on it, pushing it down, it won't.
Right.
But you know, when you can sort of do what you're referring to, it can provide that. So I really love that. And so I'm curious about how when you started to discover these things about yourself and actually put these things into practice, which I will also say that I recognize that, you know, the utilization of the awareness, the attention for this purpose is like literally like doing bicep curls in the gym. You know, every
Yeah.
time you bring it away from the thought stream back into the physical plane, into the body, into the present moment, wherever that is, it's like making that stronger so that there is the choice, you know. Um,
Right.
but I'm curious, the choice to choose differently, to you know, not have a reaction, but instead, you know, have the space to be able to say, oh, you know, maybe I'll choose these words or have a response or something, just a different response to a situation. But I'm curious, when this started to unfold for you and you began working with these things, I'm curious how things shifted for you and what your experience of life, how that sort of transformed or transfigured for you. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, you were kind of you're getting cut on and off a little bit as you're asking that question, but I'm assuming the question really pertains to like how it transformed for me in my life and
Yeah,
how.
like what the utilizing this process
Oh yeah.
of, you know, that you're sort of describing. I'm wondering how your life changed.
Oh yeah. Man, I mean, I feel like it just still keeps unfolding. I would say the biggest piece has been I didn't I went through phases of like having really extreme anxiety, and it just meant there was another level of healing needed. But I didn't realize how disconnected I was or out of alignment I was with myself. And I didn't realize how many things I was feeling really kind of almost weren't me. Do you know what I mean? They were kind of like energies that were from moments of the past, but they really didn't represent who I really am. And the more I connected with that, the more I liked what I was feeling, especially when I started shamanic healing, because that really tuned me into my intuitive skills and reminded me that I could feel energy. And so that was a little bit of a validation there. And that whole, the shamanic process is really about reclaiming your wholeness, because we are, the idea is that we come in with like a physical soul and a spiritual soul. I can't remember the other one, but one always stays whole. And the physical soul is like how we lose pieces of ourselves through our lives, like where we leave our pieces behind. And I really started to see it as a process of reclaiming the pieces of myself that I'd left behind. And I just started to kind of feel more inwardly directed. So rather, because a lot of my life had been about using the external, like people really, to validate my existence or validate if I'm doing okay. And I started to have the ability to validate from within and feel connected from within.
Mm-hmm.
And even with, and also aspects of forgiveness, understanding that, having gone through enough cycles of some negative energy coming up and feeling challenged by it, and then sitting with it in the process of transforming through that and coming out on the other side feeling so much more whole and healed, it's like I want more of that, and I want more of that. And I feel like that's what kind of drives the process for me. And then it just evolves, and then it just evolves into like being able to hold a space for myself where when a challenge comes up, I now know the cycle. So I don't have to go into it. I don't have to let it carry me to some unknown place. Like I've retrieved enough of the parts of myself that I am more whole than not whole. Does that make sense? And so I can withstand whatever challenge comes up and see it for what it is, and know that I have a process in place to move through it without losing myself in it. And knowing that it's here teaching me something that's still within me it's not working for me. And it's a sign of imbalance. So in terms of like practical way of how that's applied in my life. Like my spouse and I are now divorced, but we've been able to move through our divorce process by holding these spaces for one another. And we found a really amazing counselor that kind of speaks this language. And learning, you know, I think when a lot of people go through divorce and separation, it's like lobbing accusations at each other. And we've really kind of worked at being in a space, especially in counseling, to like figuring out how to be in our own space and witnessing the other person, and where the things that we feel triggered by is actually coming from in their own life. Does that make sense? It's kind of helped that process along, that we can know that we're going through a transition, that some kind of healing is needing to take place, and that, you know, this is kind of like how I describe unconditional love, that it's expansive enough to hold everything in it, all the negative, all the positive, and that we can hold that space with one another and cohabitate and be witnesses to one another's processes, which helps us understand one another better and be supportive of one another's healing process. I feel like that's a really good example, like, of where this kind of work is beneficial. And, you know, it's like being able to honor your own emotions when you're having a bad day, and not being hard on yourself about it. And I have kids, so, you know, it's like the same offering for them. If they're grouchy, not taking it personally, and knowing, you know, okay, they need space, or like, what do they need? They might be needing something. Like, how do we hold them in a space where they feel okay to just feel off?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So now you're able to do for your children
Mm-hmm.
what you weren't able to
Able
do.
to,
Yeah,
for, yeah,
and so in a sense, you have broken the patterning, the
yeah,
epigenetic, you know, DNA passed down, the fear, whatever it is, and how
yeah,
to
yeah,
interrupt.
yes, thank you. That is a very, yeah, key point. Yeah, and of course I still have doubts, but I wholeheartedly believe, yes, my kids are amazing, and we're very uh, upfront with them and forthcoming with things appropriately, you know, for their emotions. I feel like we've done a good job of helping them manage their own emotions and know that they're in a safe place to express their emotions. And if they need anything, or, you know, that we're here. And that's been such a strong foundation for them. So yes, I feel like when they were babies, I felt that so strongly, like their physiological needs for connection. I didn't even know about connection. Like, I feel like I know more things about it now based on like what trauma is all about, because I feel like all our negative emotions really are about feeling disconnection.
Mm-hmm.
And just somehow some part of me inherently knew babies don't cry because they're trying to manipulate. They have an actual need, and that might be a need for closeness, or for being seen, or, you know, it's like I knew those things from my own healing path, because I discovered those places in myself where those needs hadn't been met. Yes. So I feel like I've been, to the best of my ability, been able to offer that to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Your journey is profound.
It's pretty
And
profound.
yeah, it is. And you know, the wisdom that you have been able to garner from walking your path is, you know, really important to share. And so we are incredibly grateful that you were willing to share it with us today.
Thank
Um,
you.
so
Yeah.
Anya, if our listeners want to find you, where would they find you? Where are you out there on the wild world interweb?
They can look up my website. It's starhearthealing.com, and it has all the offerings that I have, and the work that I do, and a little bit of my story and descriptions of the healing modalities that I use. So
Yeah,
I feel like that's the best place for people to connect. And I
perfect.
do free clarity sessions. So if anybody is interested in working with me, I offer an hour phone call to just talk
Wow.
about what I do, and see if it's a good fit. And yeah,
Okay. Yeah,
yeah.
perfect.
And
Yeah, and go ahead.
I just want to say thank you so much, Molly, for inquiring about my story. I do feel like I have this extraordinary story. I'm still trying to figure out how to start sharing it because there's so much more. But it's really nice to be able to share, because this was my intention when I started healing work, is feeling like, you know, I've had these experiences in my life and I feel like they have a use in the universe and in the world, for people who are suffering. And my goal is really just to connect with people in that way and support people who are
Yeah.
going through challenges. So thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome. It's such a beautiful journey, and we're happy to support you in getting your work out there and supporting others. And look forward to, you know, staying in touch and seeing how things are unfolding. And
Yeah.
and one more quick question:
Mhm.
if you, given that we're in this very unique time right now, this time of quarantine and COVID, and it's a very unique time. I'm just curious if you were, you know, there's a lot of fear and anxiety that is being brought to the surface, which, you know, is actually a good thing, to metabolize that stuff. But
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you could give people like one little pearl of wisdom for, you know, working with these energies that are presenting now, what would it be?
Mm, that's such a good question. I feel like it's really about honoring what's coming up
Mhm.
and finding space, figuring out and finding space how to do that. Because I feel like our tendency, especially if it has to do with anxiety or some kind of negative emotion around fear, like our tendency is to run from it, run from that emotion. But I feel like they come up because it's letting you know something. It's actually drawing your attention towards it. So figuring out a way to be with it, um, without feeling overwhelmed by it. So that could be like journaling. I also feel like going for walks for me and like really connecting with nature is helpful to kind of like offset all the mental
Mhm.
overwhelm, and going into some kind of like sensation, like really tuning into how the wind feels on your skin, or like feeling the ground beneath your feet, or hearing the sound of water. Like any way you can connect into your senses,
Mhm.
um, can be really beneficial. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to have you, and thanks so much. Enjoy the
Thank
rest of your
you.
day, and you guys, thank you for listening and tuning in.
Thanks, Molly.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.